Heaney heard that he'd won the Nobel Prize in Literature in October 1995 when he phoned home from a hotel in the Peloponnese. He was staying in a little harbour town on the Bay of Navarino. The citation from the Nobel Committee invoked his poetry's combination of lyrical beauty and ethical depth, which exalt everyday miracles and the living past. What followed was a phenomenon he likened to a mostly benign avalanche. There was an enormous public reaction in Ireland and a torrent of invitations, honours and celebrations. His time was more heavily compromised than ever, and his reputation had become irrevocably internationalised. The consensus from serious critics was that the new Irish laureate deserved his place with Yeats and Beckett. At the Nobel Prize celebrations in December 1995, accompanied by old friends and colleagues, Heaney delivered a memorable address called Crediting Poetry. It opened with a kind of prose poem about his childhood. When I first encountered the name of the city of Stockholm, I little thought that I would ever visit it, never mind end up being welcomed to it as a guest of the Swedish Academy and the Nobel Foundation. At that particular time, such an outcome was simply beyond conception. In the 1940s, when I was the eldest child of an ever-growing family in rural County Derry, we crowded together in the 3 rooms of a traditional thatched farmstead. It was an intimate, creaturely existence. The night sounds of the horse in the stable beyond one bedroom wall mingled with the sounds of adult conversation from the kitchen beyond the other. In suspension between the archaic and the modern, we were as susceptible and impressionable as the drinking water that stood in a bucket in our scullery. Every time a passing train made the earth shake, the surface of that water used to ripple delicately, concentrically, and in utter silence. The focus then swings from silence to sound. The static crackles and staccato news announcements from the radio set, connected by a flimsy wire to an aerial in a tree outside. And one of the foreign stations on the dial is, of course, Stockholm. This is the childhood world exactly pictured in A Sofa in the 40s, a poem which would appear in Heaney's next collection. The main message is that the child was becoming attuned to words from elsewhere and beginning a journey into the wideness of language. And ultimately, coming to an understanding of this, that poetry can make an order as true to the impact of external reality as the ripples across the water in that scullery bucket 50 years ago. This is one way of crediting what poetry has brought to Heaney's consciousness, but his lecture throws a much wider net by taking in the atrocious politics of the last quarter century in Northern Ireland and the challenges to the non-combatant poet. He interrogates his own historical position and the nationalist tradition he comes from, and confronts the horrors and actualities of sectarian murder. Some years before, in 1988, Heaney had made a direct political intervention in a speech accepting a Sunday Times award. This followed hard upon a horrifying week in Northern Ireland. A Protestant paramilitary had opened fire at an IRA funeral, killing 3 people. And at the funeral of one of the victims, 2 British soldiers were dragged from their car and murdered. Heaney's speech raised the issue of Anglo-Irish relations. He regretted that the spirit of the 1985 Anglo-Irish Agreement was no longer being observed, and deplored the prejudice and complacency that characterised too much British reporting of the Irish crisis. This had not gone down well in Britain. By the time of his Nobel speech, although overtures towards peace talks were happening behind the scenes, the killing spree in his native province showed little sign of abating. The early 1990s saw car bombs and random shootings of Catholic civilians by Protestant paramilitaries. There was also the appalling IRA practice of forcing a driver to detonate a prime bomb, and himself, at a military target, by holding members of his family hostage. October 1993 was the bloodiest month since 1976, An IRA bomb in a fish and chip shop on the Shankill Road killed 10 people. And in retaliation, the Ulster freedom fighters entered a pub in Grey Steel and slaughtered 7 people. In his Nobel lecture, Heaney reached back further than the recent horrors to one particular episode in 1976. A masked gang ambushed a minibus of workmen, lined them up, and asked any Catholics among them to step out. The single Catholic did so, despite a friendly pressure on his arm from a Protestant co-worker, indicating that he wouldn't betray him. But the single Catholic did step out, and was the only man spared, as the murder gang was in fact Republican, not Loyalist. The matters at issue in this terrible true story haunt Heaney. The infliction of tribal violence obsesses him. He describes the years of attempting to contemplate histories of blood and tears, like some monk bowed over his prie-dieu, knowing himself incapable of heroic virtue or redemptive effect, but constrained by obedience to repeat the effort. Significantly, he told his Nobel audience, he found his way out by straightening up and allowing for the marvellous as well as the murderous. This was elegantly illustrated by his poem St. Kevin and the Blackbird, which conjures up the saint's immobility as a bird roosts and hatches out a brood in his hand. The conclusion of the speech turns to Heaney's predecessor, Yeats, and his Nobel address in 1923, which had strikingly avoided the subject of the recent civil wars in Ireland. In an echo of St. Kevin nurturing the blackbird, Heaney chose to quote in full Yeats's poem, The Stare's Nest by My Window. In the west of Ireland, a stare was a name for a starling. The bees build in the crevices of loosening masonry, and there the mother birds bring grubs and flies. My wall is loosening. Honeybees, come build in the empty house of the stair. We are closed in, and the key is turned on our uncertainty. Somewhere a man is killed or a house burned, yet no clear fact can be discerned. Come build in the empty house of the stair. A barricade of stone or wood, some 14 days of civil war. Last night they trundled down the road, that dead young soldier in his blood. Come build in the empty house of the stair. We had fed the heart on fantasies, the heart's grown brutal from the fair. More substance in our enmities than in our love. O honeybees, come build in the empty house of the stair. A year later, Heaney published a new poetry collection, The Spirit Level. The book opened and closed with celebrations of transcendence. The poem, Postscript, which rapidly became central to the Heaney canon, isolates a moment of joy on the windy coast of County Clare, when landscape, weather, and a kind of ecstasy come together. Useless to think you'll park and capture it more thoroughly. You are neither here nor there. A hurry through which known and strange things pass, as big soft buffetings come at the car sideways and catch the heart off guard and blow it open. The poem came, he later said, in a moment of inspiration. I had this quick sidelong glimpse of something flying past. Before I knew where I was, I went after it. There are some poems that feel like guarantees of your work to yourself. They leave you with the sense of having been visited, and this was one of them. During the latter 1990s, at a time when public invitations and obligations were raining down all around him, Heaney was imposing another kind of discipline on himself. The idea of translating the medieval English epic Beowulf had been suggested in the mid-1980s, but he only came to grips with it in the Nobel year, and it would appear in 1999 after years of unremitting work. Each morning, he wrote, I was like a man sentenced to hard labour, rolling up his sleeves, spitting on his hands and taking hold of the shaft of a sledgehammer. He spoke of it later as a hard slog and a kind of homework project. His work and reputation were now positioned at the centre of the English canon, while operating emphatically from a base in Ireland, north and south. Taken with his Nobel triumph, his position was unique and unassailable, particularly with a large popular audience. Werewolf was widely reviewed and won the Whitbread Prize. It sold phenomenally well, probably, as Heaney himself remarked, to readers who often failed to finish it. The years of toiling over Werewolf were also the years of putting together the collection Electric Light, published in 2001. In both cases, there was a burden of expectation to be borne, and the new collection was markedly uneven compared to its predecessors, as several reviewers pointed out. The book includes short and perfect poems of microscopic observation, such as the Sonnets from Hellas, notably the first, Into Arcadia. It was opulence and amen on the mountain road. Walnuts bought on a high pass from a farmer who'd worked in Melbourne once and now trained water through a system of pipes and runnels of split reed, known in Hellas, probably, since Hesiod. That was the least of it. When we crossed the border from Argos into Arcadia, and farther into Arcadia, a lorry load of apples had burst open on the road, so that for yards our tyres raunched and scrunched them, but we drove on, juiced up and fleshed and spattered, revelling in it. And then it was the goat herd, with his goats in the forecourt of the filling station, subsisting beyond eclogue and translation. But overall, even well-disposed reviewers noted a meandering element in Electric Light. In reply, Heaney affirmed that the book was fashioned out of materials that gathered themselves up without much sense of forward purpose or planning. He admitted the additional pressures of publishing since his Nobel Prize, and an inner voice saying, "They're going to be looking out for this book. You ought to button up, tighten your belt, and come out fighting." And another voice saying, "To hell with them. Just calm down. Just write your age. Be your age." What comes clearly through is an impatience with the expectations now laid upon him. "I had this feeling," he wrote, "that, genuine as the actual grief was, and constant as the distress was in our day-to-day life, the subject of the troubles was worn out, and my own earnest elegies were even beginning to bore me." Elsewhere, he put it more mordantly, "I think that the political moment, the political urgency is past for me. This is more the moment of mortality."